fads of the time with the Bible trying to defend a position on religion. It's not doing a very good job, but it got over the heads of the voters and put them in power. So there it is. And I don't condone that necessarily. I don't necessarily condone that. In these pre-presidential years, Lincoln was rather sarcastic about politicians who called upon God to support their worldly causes. Stumping for the Whig presidential candidate Zachary Taylor at Worcester, Massachusetts, September 12, 1848, he criticized the Free Soil men for mixing theology and politics. Now, a quick note here. The Free Soil men are the men who wanted, I think it was every new state that came into the Union would be free soil, would be exempt from slavery. But in general, they were against slavery. Now, these people who are against slavery, they want to abolish slavery. And everybody's saying, well, look at the consequence. You can't abolish slavery. Come on. In America, slavery is blah, 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 and it'll cause all this stuff. And the Free Soil men say, quote, we do our duty and leave the consequences to God. So they're saying, whatever horrific things may result, it's not our problem. We are doing what we know is right as per the rules of God. And it's up to God to sort it out after we're done. Lincoln says, in declaring that they would do their duty and leave the consequences to God, they merely gave an excuse for taking a course that they were not able to maintain by a fair and full argument. End quote. In other words, they couldn't argue their full case. So when their case started looking bad, they said, look, God's in charge. Okay? We're going to end slavery. God's going to sort it out. And people said half of the nation's economy depends on slavery. Half of the nation's land is encompassed in a slave economic system. How are you going to do this? And they said, we're going to eliminate slavery and God's going to take care of the details. And Lincoln didn't like that attitude. He was equally critical of pro-slavery people who enlisted God on their side. Regarding the book Slavery Ordained by God, written by a Reverend Frederick A. Ross, Lincoln noted in 1858, quote, certainly there is no contending against the will of God, but there is some difficulty in ascertaining and applying it. Was slavery so ordained? From Lincoln, the Almighty gives no audible answer to the question, and His revelation, the Bible, gives none, or, at most, none but such as admits of a squabble as to its meaning. After 1860, Lincoln himself was to refer with growing frequency to the will of God in human affairs. You know what started in 1861, so why would he mention the will of God in human affairs more often after 1860? Quote, when I knew him early in life, he was a skeptic, Joshua Speed reminisced about his lifelong friend. The only evidence I have of any change was in the summer before he was assassinated. I was invited out to the Soldiers' Home to spend the night. As I entered the room, near night, he was sitting near a window, intensely reading his Bible. Approaching him, I said, I'm glad to see you profitably engaged. Yes, said he, I am profitably engaged. Well, said I, if you have recovered from your skepticism, I am sorry to say that I have not. Looking me earnestly in the face and placing his hand on my shoulder, he said, you are wrong, Speed. Take all of this book upon reason that you can, and the balance on faith, and you will live and die a happier and better man. Lincoln read the Bible and prayed, but still belonged to no church. According to Carpenter, a member of Congress asked him why he did not join any of the Christian communions, and Lincoln explained, because I have found difficulty, without mental reservation, in giving my assent to their long and complicated confessions of faith. When any church will inscribe over its altar the Savior's condensed statement of law and gospel, quote, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind, and love thy neighbor as thyself, end quote, that church will I join with all my heart. So there was his reply to a congressman who asked him why he isn't actively engaged in a particular sect. Eventually Lincoln came to feel that fate had marked him for some much grander purpose. As president, he once told Congressman Isaac Arnold how, years before, he had declined the governorship of Oregon Territory when it was offered him. Arnold observed, "If you had gone to Oregon, you might have come back as a senator, but you would never have been president." "Yes," said Lincoln, and with a pensive expression he added, "I have all my life been a fatalist. What is to be will be, or rather, I have found all my life, as Hamlet says, there is a divinity that shapes our ends. Rough hew them how we will." Lincoln quoting Hamlet. It sounds like there he sort of sadly accepts his fate to be the instrument of a major war or something like that. He sort of sees that it's going to be a calamity, and he sort of sees that he's in the driver's seat, and he's got to do what he believes is right. He certainly couldn't say that he's going to let the South secede. You can't allow that, and you couldn't say you're going to let the South keep their slaves. We've got to do something about this. It's coming to a head, and he says, "I'm stuck in the seat, I think. There is a divinity that shapes our ends. Rough hew them how we will." Perhaps here we have a justification for the war. Quote, "All will be well in the end, because our case is just, and God will be on our side." So Lincoln spoke to a delegation of clergymen, according to a Dr. Gurley, who called at the White House during the darkest days of the war. At another time he wrote to an Illinois critic of his war methods, "Let us diligently apply the means, never doubting that a just God, in his own good time, will give us the rightful result." And yet Lincoln held to no simple and self-righteous belief that God was on his side and the devil on the other. Not that he supposed the rebel cause was just, or would win. To a Tennessee woman who sought the release of her prisoner husband with the plea that he was a religious man, he said, quote, "The religion that sets men to rebel and fight against their government, because as they think that government does not sufficiently help some men to eat their bread at the sweat of other men's faces, is not the sort of religion upon which people can get to heaven." End quote. He granted the pardon the woman wanted, all the same. Now let's visit this here a bit. Do you think he sounds a little like King George, talking about the Americans rebelling? Quote, "The religion that sets men to rebel and fight against their government." To rebel and fight against their government. This must set libertarians ablaze, but I don't think there's anything amiss about that. If you want to leave your country, that's one thing. But to say, "I'm going to leave this country and take land with me," in other words, I hereby appropriate this patch of land as free of this government. This government has protected it up till now, but I arrogate it to myself at this point. It's asinine. Can't allow people to secede from your nation. And if you did, what kind of precedent would that be? And then you would end up with the weakest nation and it would fall. You know, someone would invade or something. It's ridiculous. People inside your nation who want to secede are doing the same thing that people outside your nation who want to come and take land from you are doing. It's no different. Skipping down just a bit here. As the war dragged on past the second summer and Lincoln pondered the meaning of the bloodshed, he was more and more inclined to doubt that God was a fellow combatant. Once he jotted down his inmost thoughts on a piece of paper. He did not date this note, but it probably was written in September 1862. In it he wrote, "The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time." Oh, Abraham, how do you know that? Are you sure? God might be a contradictory fellow. According to religious people, all the suffering in the world and the fact that there's constant strife back and forth that never gets anywhere may all just be a part of God's plan. And it's inexplicable to human consciousness. But here he sets restrictions on God. Mr. Abraham Lincoln says God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. He sets God as being subject to the laws of logic and reality. In the present civil war, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party, and yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect His purpose. I am almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest, and wills that it shall not end yet, but His mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants